UFC 321 is one of the rare pay-per-views where you don't get as many winners as you do losers. You get more losers than you do winners. Why is that? We're not just talking about how many fighters won a fight and how many fighters lost the fight. There are bigger losers coming out of big UFC pay-per-view events and sometimes big winners. I did not see a big winner come out of the UFC 321 pay-per-view, but I have three of the biggest losers coming out of UFC 321, and only one of them is an individual person. We'll discuss exactly what that looks like and what we're going to be going over with the biggest losers of that. Also, a couple other things we'll be going over, maybe some little rematch conversation of Aspinall versus Gane, what Chael Sonnen and Anthony Smith said about Aspinall pulling out of the fight, what Dana White has to say about the rematch, and a bunch of other stuff. Bisping also countering it. You know how Michael Bisping is with Tom Aspinall. Welcome. This is the matchup with mmadbm, and we will be discussing the hottest takes and the hottest things, all MMA every single day. And let's go over the biggest losers of UFC 321 as we kind of have a little bit of this hangover basically from this card, because we come off of a very, very lackluster event that we all anticipated to be a lot bigger, right? It's been a day. We got a little bit off of it. I think the big overreactions people are having of Aspinall, I think people are still sticking by. We can go over that over and over again every single day. There's no point. But let's talk about the three biggest losers from UFC 321. The biggest one, obviously, the most glaringly obvious one is Tom Aspinall. The stuff that Tom Aspinall has lost out on because of this fight, because of the way this fight ended, because he had to pull out of this fight mid-fight, in a fight that looked competitive, in a fight that, regardless of how it was actually going, when you look at Tom Aspinall's face, the casual fan, the public, the media is going to showcase that Aspinall's bleeding. It's going to showcase that Aspinall's visibly damaged in this fight, and now he's pulling out, and now he's saying he can't see, and now he's taking a very peculiar way out of a fight. You don't typically see a championship fight, let alone the heavyweight champion of the world, pulling out of a fight in the middle of it because of an eye poke. Now, it's not to say that the eye poke wasn't horrible. We know how bad it was. Tom Aspinall was bandaged after it. We obviously have to talk about it a little bit more, and as Dana White said, only Tom Aspinall actually knows. But at the same time, I do believe that Tom Aspinall was severely damaged, and I don't think it would be the best idea to go in there with one eye or two eyes. It's a horrible situation for Tom Aspinall, and there is no winning, regardless of what happens there. But the biggest loser is Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall loses matchups like Alex Pereira or John Jones. He could have fought either Alex Pereira or John Jones. That's a big fight for Tom Aspinall. Those are the two biggest fights for Tom Aspinall coming out of UFC 321. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew the potential that Tom Aspinall had in big matchups, big money matchups at heavyweight because of how lackluster heavyweight is. Now you have this rematch with Ciryl Gane. I still think it's going to be majorly hyped. I still think it's going to be actually a little bit more highly anticipated because of the situation that just occurred. We all now have it a little bit more competitive. As a matter of fact, the odds right now for Ciryl Gane versus Tom Aspinall and the rematch there is now minus 166 for Tom. I'm not really much of a sportsbooks guy, but to be fair, it's always something to take note of. Minus 166 Tom Aspinall to plus 140 Ciryl Gane for the rematch between Tom Aspinall and Ciryl Gane. What that's telling you is it went from minus 425, Tom Aspinall over a minus 400 favorite, and Ciryl Gane over a plus 300 favorite, to now it being as close as minus 160 for Aspinall and plus 140 for Gane. That's an absurd overreaction because of a competitive 4 minutes in a fight where a fighter comes off of this year and a half long layup. I think there's a major overreaction by everybody on this fight. And that's how much Tom Aspinall is already losing. The hype Tom Aspinall is losing alone causes something like this. And then you have to go look at the matchups he's lost. Again, those are big money fights in Alex Pereira and John Jones. Those are two of the biggest stars you have in the UFC today. Boxing as well. His father was discussing how he prefers Tom Aspinall does not sign with the UFC after his the 3 fights on his contract are expired, until he's completely gone after that. He wanted him to go boxing. And as absurd as it sounds, we saw Francis Ngannou do it. If Tom Aspinall is disposing of people left, right, and center, what's to say that opportunity doesn't open itself up? Especially with, if we go to boxing, Alexander Usyk against heavyweights. Heavyweights are being wiped through left, right, and center. We just watched Daniel Dubois get completely decimated by Alexander Usyk again. How many more heavyweights do you have to put in front of Usyk, the guy who wants to fight for a couple more years? I think the Tom Aspinall thing definitely was going to be a possibility with either Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, whoever it could have been. It's not something that's even in the realm anymore. I don't think it's even possible. Even if he smokes Ciryl Gane right now, everyone's going to say he still has some work to do in heavyweight. You're going to have some sort of exciting heavyweight pull up. You're going to have this Pereira and Jones fight. You're going to have this constant John Jones talk over Tom Aspinall. And you're not going to have this fight really get taken off of his shoulders. He's going to have the pressure and the headache of this fight and what everybody's saying until he disposes of Gane. And now you have to rebuild a lot more of the stardom that you had. We'll see how that goes. But Aspinall loses a lot there. The sponsorships as well, of course, it comes with the money. It comes with not getting the Pereira or Jones fight as well. Moving forward, the second biggest loser from UFC 321 is the UFC. Evidently, the UFC had a gigantic event, and honestly, myself included, believe that UFC 321 would have been a very, very good pay-per-view. Been very, very hyped for this pay-per-view coming into it, because we knew it was coming after it as well, with Islam Makhachev's pay-per-view, with the Merab versus Peter Yan pay-per-view, two of the best pay-per-views I've ever seen put together, ever, in November and December. And Aspinall's return against Ciryl Gane was one of the more hyped ones we've had in a while, because we've been waiting for Tom Aspinall to come back. We've been waiting to see how he performs against the guy that John Jones beat for the heavyweight title, the guy that everybody was actually very hyped about in Ciryl Gane. I mean, not against Aspinall, but they were hyped about Ciryl Gane at the time when he fought John Jones. And obviously, look how quickly John Jones disposed of him. We've been talking about John Jones ducking Tom Aspinall, which, again, the reality of it is, John Jones did duck Tom Aspinall. He did not want to fight him. He fought Stipe Miocic instead and tried to push the greatest heavyweight of all time agenda, as if Stipe Miocic wasn't 3 to 4 years removed from competition. Refused to fight Tom Aspinall when Jones pulled out. Jones refused to fight Tom Aspinall when he was interim champion. Aspinall defends the interim belt. You know how that story goes. UFC lost big time with the heavyweight division. And again, that's the third biggest loser, is the heavyweight division, kind of tied in with the UFC. The UFC just lost out on a potential gigantic star in Tom Aspinall at heavyweight. And now you have a situation where, when are you going to rebook this heavyweight matchup? Dana White calling it a pain in the ass because of the situation that had occurred, right? He has to deal with this whole situation now of rebooking this heavyweight main event, when you've been saying that you want to talk about this White House card and booking these fights for the White House card in February. Now you have a November pay-per-view and a December pay-per-view essentially fully booked. You have Islam Makhachev as the main event. You know you're not going to take him down there. Honestly, I don't think Tom Aspinall and Ciryl Gane would co-headline that over Zhang Weili's fighting for a second division title against Valentina Shevchenko. Then you go on to the December card. I don't think you should take away a Merab Dvalishvili main event. And the UFC always puts their heavier champion over the lighter champion in terms of card order. So main event would be Aspinall versus Gane if they rebook it in December. I don't think they should take the main event away from Merab. I don't think it's a better main event than any Merab Dvalishvili fight you could put on right now, even if it's a rematch against Peter Yan. But then again, you do have the very highly anticipated Ciryl Gane versus Tom Aspinall rematch, the heavyweight rematch. Is Aspinall really not as good as we thought he was? Is Ciryl Gane actually going to beat Tom Aspinall? I mean, he had him bloodied up. Aspinall didn't look the greatest. He was fighting out of range. Are we really going to be that in tune with Tom Aspinall? And would we rather have that as a main event over Merab? I personally wouldn't. I don't want to take away a big opportunity for Merab to break the single-year title defense record. Nobody's ever done it before. 4 title defenses in a calendar year. I think it's something to take note of, especially with how special Merab has been, not only for the UFC, but how special he's been all time overall in UFC history and MMA history, where he could tie, I believe, the second longest win streak in UFC history right now if he beats Peter Yan in December at the last pay-per-view of the year. What more do you want? Then you have January, which again, we talked about it. Ilia Topuria is going to be the main event there. And then more than likely, of course, hasn't been booked yet, but it's more than likely going to be Topuria versus Paddy. And you know you are not putting anything over Topuria versus Paddy. Then you have February. We also talk about, I think, like a Perth event that may be 2 pay-per-views in January, and Volkanovski might be fighting in that. So where do you put Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane? Are you going to demote it on a card because of the situation? I'd be shocked, honestly, if TKO allows the UFC to have a Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane fight. Not on a pay-per-view, first of all. No way they put it on a fight night. And then also not be the main event because of the hype behind it. Now you have this contingency of what are we going to do with the White House fight, with the heavyweight title picture. It's going to be such an interesting situation. So I think the UFC, and then of course the heavyweight division, which what we saw with Jailton Almeida and Alexander Volkov, the disgusting robbery. That's the biggest loser right there with the main event, and obviously that as well with the number one contender fight. The only thing that they benefited was also Hamza Abdul Wahab versus Chris Barnett. Both should be cut, should not be in the UFC. It's embarrassing for the UFC that was even put on, and it showcases how bad the heavyweight division is, that the UFC feels the need to keep these guys in their company, where Chris Barnett, to be fair, and Hamza Abdul Wahab haven't really showcased anything to be a professional athlete at the highest stage of mixed martial arts. With all due respect, they just haven't. They really have not given you anything across every single fight that they've had in the UFC. So heavyweight lost big time, apart from the Walter Walker emergence, which, the UFC will probably somehow fumble. But it could be worse. It could be worse. It could always be worse. At the bare minimum, you have a new champion. You have Mackenzie Dern as your strawweight champion. All jokes aside, it was a disaster of an event, especially towards the end of it. Some big knockouts, I get it, Quill and Salco, all that stuff. But there were a lot of big losers out of UFC 321, and obviously Aspinall, UFC, and the heavyweight division suffered majorly from this event. Moving on to the Aspinall repercussions from a lot of these old fighters, the reactions from Chael Sonnen and Anthony Smith post-fight. Little bit interesting. Both former fighters saying that Tom Aspinall, as the heavyweight champion of the world, should be going out there to fight with one eye. He should be going out there. And sometimes that's exactly what you have to deal with, fighting with one eye. Anthony Smith saying it is hysterical. I think that's one thing Anthony Smith always rides on. He is Lionheart in some sense. Like, he does keep fighting, even though a lot of the fights that he's had recently, the latter end of his career, were him just turtling up at the end of it. But he always goes back to this John Jones fight, right? And they also have the Glover Teixeira fight where he's picking up his teeth and all that stuff. But the John Jones fight where he eats an illegal knee, could win by disqualification, could become heavyweight champion, could make a load of money for his family, pay-per-view points the next fight against Jones and get the life beaten out of him after that. But he chose to keep fighting after an illegal knee from Jones. And now he's essentially putting that on everybody who suffers something similar to this. Like, if you're still walking and if you're still physically competent and your brain isn't damaged horrifically, like, why aren't you going back in there? Okay, so what, you got eye poked? So what, you got nut shot? Like, get up and fight. That's what Anthony Smith is essentially saying. I think it's a load of garbage. I think Tom Aspinall, if he literally cannot see out of that eye, if it's as damaged as it was, and it seemed like it did, because those eye pokes, nasty. Every time I look into them again, it gets worse and worse and worse. I don't see how you could just tell him to go walk in there. And I think Michael Bisping also touched on it. Didn't directly respond to Chael and Anthony Smith. He also said this post-fight. But he's saying that it looked bad for Aspinall. And Aspinall realized that, okay, Cyril Gane isn't Sergey Spivak. Cyril Gane isn't, and it's not about him being afraid of Cyril Gane necessarily, but it's not Sergey Spivak. It's not like Tai Tuivasa. It's not someone rendered useless in there. It's like, okay, like, I got poked in the eye badly. I'm going to hit him with a 1-2 down the pipe in a moment. He's going to go out cold, or I could take him down in a second, submit him, and it's nothing. Especially with the rust that Aspinall has to come back from, especially with it being relatively competitive. It was shaping up to be a very good fight that I still think Aspinall would have ended up knocking him out and figuring out his range and getting back into the groove of things. I think it's good that Aspinall got some minutes in and he's going to go back in. I think it's going to benefit him a little bit. But I agree with Bisping that Aspinall should not have gone back in there. It was a nasty eye poke. If it's as bad as it is, and that's what we're going to take Aspinall's word for it, because why wouldn't you? What else do you have to say at that point? The eye gouge was bad enough for you to not think Aspinall is lying. There really is no other way to justify believing anything else. Really, like, how can you believe that Aspinall is faking it without just straight up skepticism, without being cynical, without being pessimistic about the whole situation? How can you believe that Tom Aspinall faked out of there? Because he dealt with some adversity that he's not used to after a long layoff. You think the pressure, the lights, all that stuff. It's not fair for the fighter. It's not fair for anybody involved, even for Cyril Gane, for you to just immediately anticipate, oh, Tom Aspinall's going to get out of there, and that's what you're going to sit your ground on, instead of believing that, oh, I'm watching the eye gouge. I'm watching how bad it is. I'm looking at his eye bandaged. I'm looking at him as frustrated as he gets. I don't know what more you want out of Tom Aspinall to show you that he's not the problem in this situation. Even if he's faking it, you cannot just decide that. For the stuff you were given, the evidence you were given, for everything that you saw come out of that fight, Tom Aspinall was egregiously eye-poked. Multiple times, by the way, by Cyril Gane. Disgustingly at the end there. Not intentionally. I believe it. I understand Cyril Gane was, it's a thing he does. But I don't think Cyril Gane meant to do it that badly, to that extent, to where it completely disrupted the fight and ended the fight, obviously. But to completely rip on Tom Aspinall, say he has to go back in there, I think is absurd from Chael Sonnen and Anthony Smith. Saying that Tom Aspinall may have faked it, may have tried to take the easy way out, dealt with any adversity. It's embarrassing for a lot of people to start thinking like that. I think it's a little bit comparable to like the Cerrone versus McGregor thing, where a lot of people were saying Cerrone, or it's not comparable to it, but I think it's something to kind of look at. A lot of people were saying Cerrone didn't look like he wanted to be there. Stephen A. Smith is actually one of the main guys that said that, and people were ripping on Stephen A. Smith, saying he didn't know anything about MMA. Cerrone ends up coming out and saying the lights are too bright, I didn't want to be in there. You can see the difference in those situations, and I don't think Aspinall anywhere near remotely close to that. Like, it just doesn't make sense to compare it to something similar to that. I think Aspinall is going to end up beating Gane. I think he's going to go right back into it. I think Bisping makes a lot of sense, a lot more sense than Chael Sonnen and Anthony Smith did. Bisping also said that Aspinall and Gane should be rebooked ASAP, either Madison Square Garden or in December in the pay-per-view with Merab and Jan. You cannot put him on Madison Square Garden unless you're going to put him in the undercard, unless you're going to put them as a featured bout. You're not going to put them over those two. These are two fighters in Zhang Weili and Islam Makhachev. Islam Makhachev, of course, he's the bigger star than Tom Aspinall. You're not going to put him under him. Unless you want to make one of the biggest cards ever. I'd love it. But you're just not going to put Aspinall versus Gane over those two. Zhang Weili vacated her strawweight title to go fight Valentina Shevchenko. That is a big, big fight that is very highly anticipated. A lot of you guys that completely rip on women's MMA, I understand there's a very low level to it at times. Similarly, as we just got in heavyweight. We just watched male heavyweights fight much worse than we watch a lot of these women's MMA fights. Zhang Weili versus Valentina Shevchenko is an absolute delicacy, regardless of how boring it is, in my opinion. To be fair, I'm going to end up biting my words on that if it ends up being like Rose versus Carla too. But anyways, that's a fight you cannot just put under and just bring down on 3 weeks' notice. You don't want to do that. You're already diminishing the hype on that fight. You do not. You have to make sure how that is substantial. And on the Merab versus Jan card, I think you could have space for it, but you have Pantoja and Van on there too. What are you going to do, right? It's an interesting situation. I don't know if Bisping understands exactly how they're going to do it. I think Bisping is set on Aspinall actually being a main event, and they're going to put Aspinall over them. It doesn't make sense. I don't think Bisping gets that they cannot put Aspinall as the main event over these guys. So we don't know what they're going to do with the rebooking. But yeah, Aspinall and Gane, much disaster coming out of that from UFC 321. More stuff from UFC 321. We didn't really cover Umar Nurmagomedov that much. And I think it's very important to, because we do have a title fight in bantamweight in December, where Merab's fourth title defense he's looking to defend his title for the fourth time on the year. His most recent title defense was Corey Sandhagen. Prior to that was Sean O'Malley, and then Umar Nurmagomedov at the beginning of the year. Umar has only fought one time since. We just watched him against Mario Bautista. What's next for Umar Nurmagomedov? What are we doing next for Umar Nurmagomedov? Because it's not a title fight. We know it's not a title shot. We know that Umar Nurmagomedov is not fighting for the title next, because it doesn't make sense for him to. I don't think Dana White was really too keen on it when Umar called for it at the press conference. I think the way Dana White responded kind of showcased that, where go fight this fight, and if you perform that way, we'll talk about it later. He said something similar along those lines. I think Mario Bautista as well, if he was on a 9-fight win streak and he beat Umar Nurmagomedov, I feel like Mario Bautista would have been a shoo-in for a title fight next. Because right now in bantamweight, you have Sean O'Malley, you have Corey Sandhagen, you have Peter Yan, who's fighting for the title, who has earned his way back after a 3-fight win streak, mind you. Umar Nurmagomedov won one fight since. Wasn't really the most entertaining fight in the world. The UFC is about moments. This wasn't really the biggest of moments for Umar. Honestly, the biggest moments in that fight were Mario Bautista. And when I'm talking moments, you need the shock factor. You need the oomph. You need that big effect that you get out of something when you watch a fight. Umar Nurmagomedov didn't have that in there. As great as his grappling was showcased, Mario Bautista dropping him with the knee was a bigger moment than anything Umar did in the fight. Mario Bautista with the ankle lock and threatening Umar, and then the toe hold or whatever he was doing in round one. I've watched it a couple times over. It was like an ankle lock, and then he ends up going to a toe hold a little bit. It was insane. Those were bigger moments than anything Umar did, even though, in my opinion, Umar literally dominated the fight for the entirety of the fight, apart from those two moments. Those were the two biggest moments. Umar's next fight has to be soon. Umar cannot sit there and wait. Umar cannot sit there and decide that he's going to be someone who keeps on waiting, who isn't as active. He didn't take that much damage in this fight, as far as we're concerned. Why is Umar Nurmagomedov not going to get booked soon? Umar Nurmagomedov versus Sean O'Malley is a possibility. The UFC will not do that because they do not want to screw Sean O'Malley over like that. Song Yadong versus Umar Nurmagomedov was booked prior. If they're not doing O'Malley versus Song Yadong, why are you not doing Umar Nurmagomedov versus them? You're not going to do Umar versus Corey Sandhagen again. We've seen that. We don't want to see that again. Wasn't the most entertaining fight in the world. I don't think Sandhagen has anything for the grappling. And Umar honestly did pretty decent on the feet against Sandhagen as well. Then we go on to the next couple of things we have. We could do the loser of Jan versus Merab for Umar Nurmagomedov. But then if you do that, you're waiting for the title shot. You're waiting to book Umar after the title shot. Who does Merab fight next after this? You don't have a contender for Merab next, which is why there is still the possibility of Umar fighting Merab next, because there really is nobody else. But now it's a race in bantamweight. It's a race. You have Ayman Zahabi, who just fought, and he's on this big win streak. It sucks, but he is. Davis and Figueiredo just won another fight. These bantamweights that are at the top right now need to book themselves immediately. They need a fight to get booked. And the UFC need to get some pressure on them from these bantamweights to put on a fight. Dana White says he loves fighters who want to get right back in there and fight again. This is the time for bantamweights to find themselves a way to separate, to be the next guy to fight Merab, because you know how Merab is. Merab's not going to want to take a break. Merab's not going to want to sit out for 5, 6, 7, 8 months. He might sit out till the White House card. You know what I mean? Like if he beats Peter Yan, he's earned a sixth month vacation, 5-month vacation. Not even. It would be like 2 months off and then a fight camp for Merab. 2 to 3 months off and then a fight camp. That's normal for Merab, even 4. Like, and you know how Merab is with his months off. Like, he's not going to be taking much off. Merab's 34 years old, going to be turning 35. Like, he loves this more than anything. You know how it's going to be. You need to be that bantamweight fighter that's going to separate right now. You need to be that bantamweight fighter that can go ahead and showcase that he could be the next guy up. O'Malley's not going to get it after one fight after losing to Merab twice. If Peter Yan beats Merab, you have that opportunity for O'Malley, but O'Malley needs to win a fight now. Umar needs to get booked immediately if he wants a title shot. O'Malley needs to get booked immediately if he wants a title shot as soon as possible. You need to present yourself with that opportunity, and right now bantamweight is very, very open with those opportunities. Sandhagen versus O'Malley is also something to do. Then you could have like Song Yadong or Zahabi or Figgy fight Umar. Umar just has to say yes to whatever fight's in front of him right now, ASAP. Right now after UFC 321, the dry spell's kind of getting a little bit it's going to suck. We have UFC 322 coming up and UFC 323, but the 2 fight night cards that we have aren't necessarily the greatest. I think the main events are fun. I think they are entertaining. I just don't necessarily love what's in front of us. I think the UFC and the big problem that they have right now, coming off of these big events, especially pay-per-views, is the most prevalent thing that's come out of TKO as a company when they've owned the WWE and the UFC is they're so focused on these main cards. Not main cards, the pay-per-view cards. They're so focused on them that you don't have as big of these fight night cards. Even when they travel a lot of the time. Like, we just had the Brazil card, and the Brazil card was fantastic, right? Love the Brazil card. Absolutely love the Brazil card. They finally did something very well with it. Wish we had a lot more of the Brazilian talent, the top Brazilian talent, and I feel like there is no excuse for it. But you had Charles Oliveira. You kept him on the card, even with the fallout of Rafael Fiziev. It works. And Charles Oliveira had a massive moment. Figueiredo won on that card as well. You go back to some of the other ones. Alberg versus Reyes. They're capitalizing on some of the Australian talent. But the Oceania region literally had all of their fighters off of this card. Volkanovski, Adesanya, Jack Della Maddalena, like literally anybody you could think of. That card was so thin. It was Jimmy Crute as the co-main event. I mean, what are we doing here? Jimmy Crute versus Ivan Ruslan, by the way. It's not like it was anything of substance. No. Anytime the UFC travels, they have to go centralize in that area, and they're not really putting on those events as big. We used to have some title fights on fight nights. TKO doesn't do that anymore because they want to make as much money as possible on these big events. I think ESPN might be a little bit of a factor in that right now, and we'll see how it goes with Paramount Plus. But you have Steve Garcia versus David Onama, and then Gabriel Bonfim versus Randy Brown in back-to-back UFC Apex cards in 2025. We are not traveling to a city. We are not giving a city another fight night. We are not giving a city who hasn't had one in another fight night. The city that I live in hasn't had a fight night in God knows how long. What are we waiting for? What are we waiting for to keep traveling? The UFC doesn't have the money to go travel and start booking these events. It's that difficult. Just seems like everybody can book a concert. Anybody can book anything in arena nowadays. But the UFC struggles. Having two back-to-back fight nights off of this pay-per-view and these fight nights in between UFC 321 and UFC 322 being UFC Apex events completely diminishes the hype the UFC has had coming into UFC 321, and you can build so much hype for the UFC going into UFC 322. And here's another thing. With these little dry spells the UFC gives themselves, especially when they go to the Apex, you have Islam Makhachev versus Jack Della Maddalena, right? And you have some big welterweight fights on the same card in Sean Brady versus Michael Morales, in Leon Edwards versus Carlos Pratas. And then the card right after that, you have Sarukian versus Hooker. Sarukian obviously was booked to fight Islam Makhachev. And you have Bilal Muhammad versus Ian Gary. That's another fight that's going to be very indicative to see where that welterweight title goes after. That's good. I always like having something immediately before it. They have a welterweight main event before that card to kind of, give some implications on that welterweight. It's Gabriel Bonfim versus Randy Brown. Who really cares about that? Would have been nice to have maybe the Gary versus Muhammad fight as a main event on that card, but it's nice to have it on that very big UFC Qatar card. Not going to complain about that too much. I just think the UFC can kind of set these things up a little bit better to where you have even more hype going into these big events as opposed to two garbage cards in the Apex with no hype. You're not expecting to have like a lot of fun watching a new city, watching a new crowd, looking at certain fighters fight for that crowd, actual promising prospects look like big stars. I mean, when they went to the UK after leaving the COVID dry spell, I mean, how big of a star was Molly McCann? And you got a Barstool contract, Molly McCann did, as a pretty subpar, that's honestly being relatively generous, fighter in the UFC, walking around with the UFC title, taking it from somebody in the crowd, and walking around the octagon with the UFC title. Molly McCann became a star and made a stupid amount of money because of something like that. You get those big moments. And the UFC felt amazing at that point. People were ready to watch Molly McCann fight. Even though the diehards knew a lot of the situation that was occurring with Molly McCann, that she's not the greatest of fighters overall, she was entertaining. She was entertaining. She was giving you a big moment. She gave you a spinning back fist or a spinning elbow or whatever it was against Luana Carolina, knocking her out in the UK. And then Paddy Pimblett goes on to do what he does against Jordan Levitt or Vargas or whoever it is that he fought at the time. Like, you get those big moments in those cards. These are the events you put on in between pay-per-views. Something that has to do with a big fight coming in on a pay-per-view in that weight class. So, like, Zhang Weili versus Valentina Shevchenko. Why don't we have a flyweight number one contenders fight or something similar to that the week before? Why don't we have some big women's flyweight implication fight then? I think these are big things that UFC misses throughout every single year, and especially in 2025, where the promotion's at an absolute minimum. It's so dead right now because of how bad the UFC is booking a lot of these. The timing of booking is just as important, if not more important, than the booking itself, because you can hype it. The timing and the location is immediately way more important, and the UFC is blundering that in 2025 substantially. And I'll never understand where this promotion downfall is going. Maybe it is the ESPN deal, and we're going to give them another bit of leeway, another bit of... I know how it's going to happen. We know how the UFC works. We know how, when they get into this Paramount deal in January, how it's going to look like heaven. Paramount released a little... I mean, I don't even know heaven, because Paramount released a video about... It's like a little promotion video for the UFC entering 2026. The opener to the video was Israel Adesanya. I mean, of all people, okay, fine, Adesanya. John Jones was a part of it. It was a younger John Jones crawling in. Why? What's going on with that? What's going on with that? Why do we have John Jones, a younger John Jones, like a 20-some-year-old John Jones, in a promotional video in 2025 going into 2026 for UFC? I know it seems very trivial to complain about something like this, but again, you're not promoting the guys you have. You're not highlighting these big stars. You're not trying to make a big star as much as you were before. Conor McGregor was the biggest star you'll ever have in the UFC. I mean, never say never, but at the end of the day, good luck ever reciprocating that because of the upbringing that he had with the UFC and how he built the UFC basically brick by brick alone. You could say Chuck Liddell. You could say all this stuff before that. Conor McGregor is what revolutionized the UFC. It's him and Ronda Rousey. There's nobody else that's even close to it. Where do you get the promotion videos that you had with that? Where do you get the media tours that you had with McGregor and Aldo, with McGregor and Diaz, with Khabib and McGregor? Everything that you have with these guys is a substantially different thing than you had now. Yes, it's Conor McGregor. Yes, there's more demand. I guarantee you there will be demand for any Ilia Topuria fight, especially if it's a big enough fight, to have something like that. These fighters need to be persistent about it. The UFC needs to enforce it even more because you will build the company better. They know what they're doing with this. They built it this way, but why exactly are they straying away from this promotion? There is no excuse for straying away from promotion the way the UFC has. And I think it hinders a lot of their title fights. I think it hinders the hype around it. But then you just come to UFC 322, you look at this card, and you're like, does it really need more promotion? Probably what the UFC looks at it as. Imagine a really sick promotional video for Islam Makhachev. Something of him, like, testing the waters of being the GOAT in UFC. I mean, tying Anderson Silva's longest fight win streak in UFC history, but also being a 2-division champion that Anderson Silva couldn't accomplish. And he would have finished 10-11 of those opponents. I mean, the resume that he has is, in my opinion, better than Jones's, better than Anderson Silva's, just in the level of competition and the performances against that level of competition. That's a video you could put on with a new champion in Jack Della Maddalena, a new young a power puncher, an insane boxer. Like, you could push a really sick 30-second to 1-minute promotion video for Jack Della Maddalena versus Islam Makhachev, for Zhang Weili versus Valentina Shevchenko, and it would build this up amazingly. I mean, the amount of AI you could use to produce a lot of stuff like this too. Like, it's so simple for the UFC to promote these things, and they just completely go away from it. And you have these dry spells, and that's what makes these dry spells even less and less and less entertaining. No one really cares to look for UFC content, to look for what's going on in the UFC between UFC 321 and UFC 322, because we don't have an interesting fight. We don't have a compelling argument to watch a 6-hour card to lead up to Steve Garcia versus David Onama, apart from the fact that it's going to be a sick fight. But then what? Waldo Cortez versus Ante Delija as the co-main event. I get its decent implications for heavyweight. We don't care. You didn't hype the fight enough. You didn't give us a reason to care about this. And I think also that kind of plays into the fighter's psyche a little bit, with their fight not really being shown much importance. The nerves aren't there as much. The focus on this fight isn't as prevalent, isn't as big, isn't as important. They aren't as hyper fixated on everything they do in the fight. The pressure isn't as on. The lights aren't as bright. And then they're fighting in the apex. You're minimizing these fights for these fighters. You're minimizing it in the co-main event. You're minimizing this main event because I just looked at Jeremiah Wells and Themba Gorimbo is on a main card in 2025. I mean, do we see what we're dealing with here? We're dealing with Themba Gorimbo versus Jeremiah Wells on a main card, possibly the featured bout in a 2025 UFC event. You know, a lot of issues the UFC has to resolve with this promotional thing, and I think they have every excuse in the book to open up for Paramount, and they can front load it and then just be like, okay, we did our promotion in the beginning, like, who cares? Everyone's going to watch now on Paramount anyways. I hope they use this as a fresh start. I hope they use this as a screw you to ESPN. Whatever it is, whatever the motivation is for the UFC to be able to work on this and to be able to push forward into better promotion and just making every fight and every fight card feel more important, because that's how you win fans over. That's how you get everything into the situation you want it to be. That's how you get everybody watching UFC more and more and more. You highlight the importance of your events. You highlight and you don't just shove them in an apex. You take them to cities you haven't been to in God knows how long. You travel outside of when's the last time the UFC did an event in Russia? The amount of Russian champions, the amount of top-end Russian fighters that they've had. When's the last time they've done that? Makhachev, Khabib. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Talks for Georgia, for Merab, and I guess Topuria. You never know. But yeah, lots to go over with that stuff with the promotion. The UFC, I think they could do a lot better overall. Coming off of UFC 321, especially as miserable as it was. You go off of miserable going into miserable. It's going to suck until UFC 322. Then you get to that fight week. Now you get everybody getting back into the groove. I think it's a big mistake the UFC makes very frequently, especially in 2025, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Hopefully 2026 gets a little bit better. But appreciate you guys all for watching. We are going to be ending this episode today, the show today rather, right now. And I appreciate you guys for being here. We'll see you guys tomorrow on tomorrow's episode. Leave your likes, comments, etc. And let me know if anything, and subscribe. Make sure you guys go subscribe. That's the most important part. If you guys have any suggestions for the show, if you guys like anything, want to see anything in particular, you guys don't like something that's in this show, always let me know. I respond to the comments in the YouTube videos. I respond to my DMs on Discord, my DMs on TikTok at MMA_DBM. So yeah, appreciate every single one of you guys for watching. Keep in tune, and let's see you guys tomorrow. Peace out.